Terrified, I admitted. Good. That means you're taking it seriously. Emma, you have real potential. Don't let anyone, including yourself, convince you otherwise. As summer approached and my start date at culinary school drew near, I spent my days practicing techniques, building my knife skills, and working my way through more advanced cookbooks. Mrs. Chen had become my unofficial tasting partner, offering honest feedback on my experiments. "This sauce needs more acid," she'd say, tasting my latest creation. "Try a splash of rice wine vinegar." "How did you know that?" I asked, amazed by her palate. 60 years of cooking," she smiled. "You develop instincts. You're developing them. And too, you know. I can see it in how you taste food now, how you adjust seasoning without looking at recipes." She was right. Somewhere in the past year I had stopped cooking with fear and started cooking with confidence. I understood now that the burnt lasagna that had ended my marriage wasn't about cooking at all. It was about trying to be someone I wasn't, trying to meet expectations that had nothing to do with who I really was. The woman preparing to enter. Culinary school bore little resemblance to the one who had stood crying in her kitchen a year ago. That woman had been defined by her failures. This woman was defining herself by her potential. David had wanted a wife who could cook. What he was going to get was a chef who had found her calling. Chapter 4. The sweet taste of success. 2 years later, I stood in the kitchen of Sage, one of Chicago's most prestigious restaurants, as the sous chef during the dinner rush. The controlled chaos around me was exhilarating. Orders flying in, flames dancing over burners, the precise choreography of professional service that I had dreamed about during those long nights of culinary school. Order up. 2 duck confit, 1 salmon. "One vegetarian tasting menu," called Chef Martinez, our head chef and James Beard Award winner. "Yes, chef," I responded, my hands already moving to plate the duck with the seasonal vegetables I had prepped earlier. The muscle memory was automatic now. The perfect quenelle of puree, the precise placement of microgreens, the final drizzle of reduction that brought the dish together. Culinary school had been everything Dean Patterson had warned and more. 16-hour days, burns on my arms from commercial ovens, the constant pressure to perform at a professional level. I had cried in the walk-in cooler more times than I could count, questioned my decision during every practical exam, and nearly quit 3 times during my externship at a downtown steakhouse where the executive chef ran his kitchen like a military operation. But I had also discovered something I had never experienced before. I was truly, genuinely good at something. Not just competent, but gifted. My palate developed rapidly. I could break down flavors and understand how to build them. My knife skills became precise and efficient. Most importantly, I learned to work under pressure without falling apart. "Emma," Chef Martinez called during a brief lull in service. "Table 12 wants to send compliments to whoever prepared the duck. That's the 3rd one tonight." I felt the familiar rush of pride that came with recognition. After graduation, I had worked my way up from prep cook to line cook to sous chef in just 18 months. Unusually fast progression in an industry known for grinding people down. "Thank you, chef. I'm putting you in charge of developing next month's seasonal menu," he continued. "I want to see what you can do with spring ingredients." This was the opportunity I had been working toward. Creating my own dishes, putting my stamp on the food that went out to diners. That night, after service ended and the kitchen was cleaned, I sat in the empty dining room with a notepad, sketching out ideas for dishes that would showcase the fresh flavors of spring in Chicago. As I walked to my car around midnight, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Emma, this is David. I know this is out of the blue, but I'd like to talk. Are you free for coffee this week?" I stared at the message for a long moment. We hadn't spoken since that phone call 2 years ago when he'd told me about Rebecca. I had heard through mutual friends that they had gotten engaged, then broken up, then gotten back together. The details of his life felt like stories about a stranger. I typed back, "I'm pretty busy with work, but I could do coffee on Monday afternoon." We met at a small cafe in Lincoln Park, not far from the Green City Market, where I still shopped for ingredients. David looked older, I thought, more tired around the eyes. He was still impeccably dressed, still handsome, but there was something different about his posture, less confident perhaps. "You look amazing," he said as I sat down across from him. "Really amazing, different." I was different. The woman sitting across from him had short hair now, efficiently styled for working in professional kitchens. My hands bore the small scars and burns that marked every cook, badges of honor in the culinary world. I was stronger, more confident, more comfortable in my own skin than I had ever been during our marriage. "Thank you. You wanted to talk?" David stirred his coffee nervously. "I heard you're working at Sage now. That's incredible, Emma. I had no idea you were doing so well. It's been a journey. I also heard you won some kind of competition." I nodded. 3 months earlier, I had entered the Young Chef Challenge, a citywide competition for culinary professionals under 30. My menu of modern interpretations of Midwestern classics had earned me first place and a write-up in Chicago Magazine. "The recognition has been nice," I said simply. "Rebecca and I broke up," he said suddenly. "For good this time. I've been doing a lot of thinking about us, about what happened." I sipped my latte and waited for him to continue. "I was wrong, Emma, about everything. The way I treated you, the things I said. I was so focused on what I thought a marriage should look like that I never saw who you really were." His voice cracked slightly. "I threw away 7 years with an incredible woman because I was too stubborn and selfish to support you while you figured things out." The words I had longed to hear 3 years ago felt strange now, almost anticlimactic. The validation I had once desperately needed from him was irrelevant. I had found it within myself. "David, I appreciate you saying that. I've been following your career. The magazine article, the restaurant reviews that mention you by name. I'm so proud of what you've accomplished." He reached across the table, his hand hovering near mine. "I know this sounds crazy, but I can't stop thinking about us, about what we could be now that we've both grown." I looked at this man who had once been the center of my world, who had defined my worth by my failures in his kitchen. The irony wasn't lost on me. Now that I had become the chef he had once mocked me for trying to be, he wanted me back. "David, what we had was real, and it mattered, but it's over. But we're different people now. You're this amazing chef, and I've learned so much about myself. We could try again." "I am different," I agreed. "I'm someone who knows her worth now. I'm someone who has found her passion and worked incredibly hard to build a career. I'm someone who doesn't need anyone else's approval to feel complete." From local farmers. The divorce had been finalized in February, and with my settlement, I had enough money to support myself for a year while I figured out my next steps. "This asparagus was picked yesterday morning," explained Martha, a farmer, "from outside the city, as she handed me a bundle of perfectly green spears. The trick is to use it within 2 days for the best flavor." I nodded, mentally planning a risotto that would showcase the vegetable's delicate taste. These Saturday morning market trips had become my favorite ritual, wandering through the stalls, talking to vendors, discovering ingredients I'd never heard of 6 months ago. "Emma!" a familiar voice called out. I turned to see Janet, a classmate, from my cooking courses, approaching with her arms full of produce bags. "Are you ready for tonight?" Tonight was the culmination of our intermediate series, a dinner party where each student would prepare and present a 3-course meal to the class. I had been planning my menu for weeks: spring pea soup with mint oil, pan-seared salmon with lemon herb butter and strawberry shortcake with homemade whipped cream. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, though my stomach was churning with nervous excitement. That evening, the teaching kitchen at Kendall College buzzed with activity as 12 amateur cooks transformed into temporary chefs. The familiar sounds of sizzling pans, chopping knives, and Chef Rodriguez's guidance filled the space. "Remember," she called out over the organized chaos, "presentation matters, but flavor comes first. Trust your palate." I worked methodically through my prep, blanching peas for the soup, seasoning my salmon, preparing my mise en place like I'd been taught. The professional kitchen environment felt natural now, the high-powered burners, the commercial equipment, the rhythm of service. As I plated my pea soup, swirling the bright green mint oil in a delicate spiral, I felt a calmness I'd never experienced in my home kitchen during the early days. My hands were steady, my timing precise. "Beautiful color," commented Chef Rodriguez as she tasted my soup. She chewed thoughtfully, her expression neutral. "The seasoning is spot on. Good balance of sweet and savory. The mint oil adds brightness, without overwhelming the pea flavor." When it came time to present our meals to the class, I stood in front of my 3 dishes with pride rather than the terror I would have felt a year ago. The salmon was perfectly cooked, crispy skin, tender, flesh that flaked at the touch of a fork. The shortcake was golden and buttery, paired with strawberries I had macerated with just a touch of balsamic vinegar. "This is restaurant quality," said Marcus, another classmate, as he finished his portion. "Emma, you've really found your groove." After class, Chef Rodriguez pulled me aside. "I want to talk to you about something. Have you given any thought to culinary school? Real culinary school?" My heart skipped. I hadn't really considered it as a possibility." "You should. You've progressed faster than anyone I've taught in community classes. You have natural palate development, good knife skills, and most importantly, you understand that cooking is about more than just following recipes." She handed me a brochure. "There's an accelerated program starting this fall. It's intensive, 16 months full-time, but it would give you the foundation for a real career in food." That night, I sat in my kitchen, my sanctuary now, with the culinary school brochure spread before me. The Culinary Institute of Chicago offered an associate degree in culinary arts, with specializations in various cuisines and restaurant management. The cost was significant, but with careful budgeting, I could manage it. The phone rang around 10 p.m. David's name appeared on the caller ID. "Hi, Emma. I hope I'm not calling too late." "It's fine. What's up?" "Well, I wanted to let you know that I'm seeing someone. Rebecca. We met at the firm." His voice carried a note of awkwardness. "I thought you should hear it from me before Chicago's legal community started talking. The news should have hurt more than it did. 6 months ago, it would have devastated me. But sitting in my kitchen, surrounded by cookbooks and notes from my classes, with the scent of vanilla still lingering from my shortcake preparation, I felt only a mild sadness for what we'd lost." "I hope you're happy," I said, and meant it. "Thank you, that's very mature of you." He paused. "How are you doing?" "Really?" "I'm thinking about culinary school." "Culinary school?" His surprise was evident. "Like to become a professional chef?" "Maybe. I've been taking classes and apparently I'm not as hopeless in the kitchen as we thought." David laughed, but it sounded forced. "Emma, that's great that you're pursuing a hobby. But culinary school is serious. It's incredibly demanding. The restaurant industry is brutal, I know. I just don't want you to set yourself up for disappointment. Cooking classes are one thing, but running a professional kitchen," his doubt stung, but it also ignited something fierce in me. "David, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not the same person I was when we were married." "Of course not. I just think you should be realistic about your limitations." After we hung up, I stared at the culinary school brochure for a long time. David's words echoed in my mind, but so did Chef Rodriguez's encouragement and the pride I'd felt serving my three-course meal tonight. The next morning I called the admissions office. Culinary Institute of Chicago, this is Maria. Hi, I'd like to schedule a campus tour and speak with someone about your accelerated culinary arts program. 3 weeks later, I walked through the professional kitchens at CIC, observing students working with intense focus under the guidance of chef instructors. The energy was electric, the precision, the teamwork, the creative passion that filled every corner of the teaching kitchens. Our graduates work in some of Chicago's finest restaurants, explained Dean Patterson as we toured the facilities. We also have strong partnerships with hotels, catering companies, and food service corporations. But I won't lie to you. This program is challenging. We have a high dropout rate because people underestimate the physical and mental demands. In the advanced kitchen, I watched a group of second-year students preparing what looked like a complex tasting menu. Their movements were fluid, professional, each person understanding their role in the larger symphony of service. That's our capstone project, Dean Patterson explained. Students design and execute a full restaurant service for invited guests. It's their final exam, essentially. I could picture myself in that kitchen, working alongside other passionate cooks, learning from master chefs, developing the skills that would transform me from a home cook into a professional. That afternoon, I submitted my application. The acceptance letter arrived 6 weeks later, along with a partial scholarship based on my performance in the community classes and Chef Rodriguez's recommendation. I called her immediately. "Congratulations," she said warmly. "I had a feeling you'd get in. Are you nervous?" I nodded eagerly, desperate for any guidance. Dorothy pulled out a simple, well-worn cookbook titled The Joy of Cooking Basics. "This one saved my marriage 40 years ago," she chuckled. "I was a disaster in the kitchen when I got married. My poor husband lived on sandwiches and canned soup for months. What changed? I realized that cooking isn't about being perfect. It's about learning to feed yourself and the people you care about. It's about patience, practice, and forgiving yourself when things go wrong." She handed me the book. "Start with scrambled eggs, master that, then move to pasta. Build your confidence one dish at a time." That afternoon, I stood in my kitchen with the cookbook open to page 12. Perfect. Scrambled eggs. The instructions seemed straightforward enough. Crack 3 eggs into a bowl, add a splash of milk, whisk, then cook on medium-low heat while stirring constantly. I cracked the first egg. Shell fragments fell into the bowl. "Okay, Emma," I said, aloud to the empty kitchen. "You can do this." By the 4th attempt, I had learned to crack eggs on a flat surface instead of the bowl's edge. By the 6th attempt, I had perfectly smooth, creamy scrambled eggs sitting on my plate. They were simple, basic, but they were mine. I had made them without burning anything, without setting off the smoke alarm, without calling for takeout. Took a bite and nearly cried. Not because they were extraordinary, they weren't, but because for the first time in years I had successfully created something edible with my own hands. Over the next month, I worked through Dorothy's suggested progression methodically. Scrambled eggs led to omelettes, which led to simple pasta dishes, each small success built upon the last. I burned things occasionally. A grilled cheese sandwich that turned to charcoal, spaghetti that stuck together in a gummy mass. But instead of throwing in the towel, I learned from each mistake. The loneliness was the hardest part. Our house felt cavernous without David's presence, without the familiar sounds of his routine, but the kitchen began to feel different. Instead of a place of failure and shame, it was becoming a laboratory where I experimented and learned. One evening in late November, as Chicago's first snow began to fall, I was attempting my most ambitious dish yet, chicken parmesan. The recipe seemed manageable, but as I pounded the chicken breast between sheets of plastic wrap, I heard a knock at my door. "Emma, it's Mrs. Chen from next door." I opened the door to find my elderly neighbor holding a steaming casserole dish, her cheeks pink from the cold. "I made too much beef stew," she said with a knowing smile. "Would you like some?" The truth was, Mrs. Chen probably hadn't made too much of anything. She had likely noticed that I'd been living alone, had seen the divorce papers being delivered, had observed my kitchen light burning late into the evening as I struggled with my culinary education. "That's very kind of you," I said, accepting the dish gratefully. "You know," she said, unwrapping her scarf, "I've been watching you through the window. You're in that kitchen every night now." I blushed, embarrassed that my failures had been so visible. "My grandmother used to say that cooking is like learning to love yourself," Mrs. Chen continued. "It takes patience, forgiveness, and practice. Would you like to learn how to make this stew?" That night, Mrs. Chen taught me her secret to perfectly tender beef stew, browning the meat properly, building layers of flavor, and the patience to let it simmer slowly. As we cooked together, she told me about coming to America from Taiwan 50 years ago, about learning to adapt her traditional recipes to American ingredients, about the comfort she found in feeding her family. "Cooking is about more than following recipes," she said, as we waited for the stew to finish simmering. "It's about understanding ingredients, about developing your palate, about creating something nourishing from simple components." When David called the next week to discuss final divorce details, I was in the middle of preparing Mrs. Chen's stew recipe for the third time, perfecting my technique. "You sound different," he said over the phone. "Different how?" "I don't know. Lighter, maybe." "How are you managing on your own? Are you eating actual meals or living on cereal and takeout?" The old Emma would have been defensive, ashamed. But this Emma had just successfully prepared a beef stew that filled her kitchen with incredible aromas. "I'm learning to cook," I said simply. David laughed, not unkindly. "Emma, you've been saying that for years. This time is different." There was a pause. "Well, good for you. I'm glad you're finding yourself or whatever." After we hung up, I ladled the stew into a bowl and sat at my dining room table. Outside, snow continued to fall, creating a peaceful blanket over our neighborhood. The stew was rich, hearty, perfect. I had made it myself from scratch with my own hands. For the first time since David had asked for the divorce, I felt something other than sadness or shame. I felt proud. That weekend I signed up for a basic cooking class at Kendall College of Culinary Arts. The instructor, Chef Rodriguez, was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who had worked in restaurants across Chicago. On the first day, she looked around our small class of 12 students. "Some of you are here because you want to cook for your families. Some of you are here because you're starting over. Some of you think you might want to make this a career." Her eyes met mine briefly. "Whatever your reason, understand this. Cooking is not about natural talent. It's about repetition, attention to detail, and the willingness to fail and try again." As we learned to properly hold a knife, to make a basic vinaigrette, to sear a piece of fish without overcooking it, I felt something awakening in me that I had never experienced before. It wasn't just the satisfaction of successfully completing a dish. It was a deeper understanding of flavors, techniques, the science behind what made food work. "Emma," Chef Rodriguez said after our third class, "you have good instincts. Have you considered taking our intermediate series?" I had been thinking about little else. Every free moment was spent in my kitchen, practicing what I'd learned, experimenting with new combinations. Food Network had become my constant companion, and I found myself taking notes while watching technique demonstrations. "I think I'd like that," I said. As December approached and our divorce neared finalization, I realized that David had been right about one thing. We had grown apart. But not in the way he thought. I wasn't the same person who had stood in that kitchen 3 months ago, crying over burnt lasagna. I was discovering parts of myself that I hadn't known existed. The kitchen was no longer a place of failure. It was becoming the place where I was rebuilding my life, one perfectly seasoned dish at a time. Chapter 3. Finding my fire by spring, I had completed the intermediate cooking series and was spending every weekend at the Green City Market in Lincoln Park, learning about seasonal ingredients. Chapter 1. The breaking point. The smell of burnt lasagna filled our suburban Chicago kitchen as I frantically waved a dish towel at the smoke detector, its shrill beeping echoing through our modest 2-story home. October rain pelted against the windows, matching the storm brewing inside my marriage. "Emma, seriously." David's voice cut through the chaos as he walked in from work, his expensive suit still pristine despite the late hour. His briefcase hit the marble countertop with a thud that seemed to punctuate his disappointment. "I specifically asked for something simple tonight. The Hendersons are coming over in an hour." I turned off the oven, my hands shaking slightly as I pulled out what was supposed to be our dinner. The cheese had turned an unappetizing shade of brown, and the edges were completely charred. 7 years of marriage, and I still couldn't master something as basic as lasagna. "I followed the recipe exactly," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The kitchen, with its gleaming appliances and granite countertops that David had insisted on during our renovation, suddenly felt like a monument to my failures. David loosened his tie, running his hand through his perfectly styled blonde hair. At 32, he was everything I had dreamed of when we met in college: successful, ambitious, handsome. But lately his blue eyes held nothing but frustration when he looked at me. "Emma, we've been married for 7 years. 7 years, and you still can't make a decent meal." He opened the refrigerator, staring at its contents as if willing a miracle to appear. "Do you know how embarrassing it is when my colleagues ask about home-cooked meals and I have to make excuses?" The words stung because they were true. While David climbed the corporate ladder at his law firm, I had floundered through various part-time jobs, never quite finding my place. Cooking was supposed to be intuitive, natural for women, or so everyone said. Yet here I stood, 29 years old, feeling like a complete failure in my own kitchen. "I can order something," I offered, already reaching for my phone. "That new Italian place delivers—" "No." David's voice was firm. "I'm tired of takeout boxes filling our trash can. I'm tired of making reservations every time we want a decent meal. I'm tired of—" He paused, and in that silence I heard everything he couldn't say. The doorbell rang, and David closed his eyes briefly. "That's them. Order pizza. I'll tell them you're not feeling well." As he went to greet the Hendersons, I stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of another culinary disaster. Through the window, I could see our neighbor Mrs. Chen tending to her herb garden despite the light rain, her movements confident and purposeful. Everything about her seemed to flow naturally, especially in the kitchen. I'd seen her through her window, effortlessly creating meals that filled her home with incredible aromas. The conversation from the living room drifted back to me as I cleaned up the mess. David's laugh sounded forced as he made light of the situation, probably spinning some story about my fictional illness. Tom Henderson's voice carried clearly, "Sarah's been perfecting her grandmother's pot roast recipe. Maybe Emma should get some tips." I scraped the burnt lasagna into the garbage disposal, each piece falling with a wet thud that seemed to echo my shame. The kitchen timer on the counter blinked 7:30 p.m., reminding me of all the evenings that had ended like this, with disappointment, takeout containers, and the growing distance between David and me. Later that night, after the Hendersons had left with polite smiles and David had retreated to his home office, I sat at our dining room table with a glass of wine. The rain had intensified, creating rivulets down the window that caught the streetlight outside. Our wedding photo on the mantelpiece showed two young people full of hope and dreams. I barely recognized that version of myself. David emerged from his office around 11, his tie now completely removed and his shirt sleeves rolled up. He looked exhausted, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the man I'd fallen in love with. "Emma, we need to talk." Those 5 words landed in my stomach like ice. I set down my wineglass and turned to face him fully. "I've been thinking about us, about our marriage." He sat down across from me, his hands folded on the table. "We're not the same people we were in college. We've grown apart. David, if this is about dinner, it's not just about dinner." His voice was gentle but firm. "It's about everything. We don't connect anymore. We don't share interests. We don't even eat meals together because—" He gestured helplessly toward the kitchen. "I can learn," I said desperately. "I can take cooking classes. I can—" "Emma, you've been saying that for years." He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "I think we both deserve to be happy, really happy, and I don't think we can find that together anymore." The words hung in the air between us like a guillotine blade. Outside, a car drove past, its headlights briefly illuminating our living room before disappearing into the night. "You want a divorce?" It wasn't a question. David nodded slowly. "I think it's for the best. We can do this amicably. I've already spoken to a lawyer." "You've already spoken to a lawyer?" The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. "How long have you been planning this?" "Emma, please don't make this harder than it has to be." I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Don't make this harder. You're ending our marriage because I can't cook a lasagna, and I'm not supposed to make it hard. It's not just about the cooking, and you know it." But as I looked at his face, as I saw the finality in his eyes, I realized that it was about the cooking. It was about every burnt dinner, every failed attempt, every takeout container that represented my inadequacy as a wife. In David's mind, I had failed at the most basic requirement of being a woman, a partner, a wife. That night, I lay in our guest bedroom, staring at the ceiling as rain continued to pound against the windows. David's words echoed in my mind. 7 years, and you still can't make a decent meal. The failure felt absolute, encompassing not just my cooking, but my entire identity. But somewhere in the darkness, beneath the pain and humiliation, something else stirred, a tiny flame of defiance that refused to be extinguished. If David wanted to reduce our entire marriage to my inability to cook, then maybe it was time to show him, and myself, what I was really capable of. The next morning, I would start over, not just in my kitchen, but in my life. Chapter 2. The First Step Forward. 3 weeks after David moved out of our house, I found myself standing in the cookbook section of Barnes & Noble in downtown Chicago, feeling completely overwhelmed. The divorce papers had been filed, our assets were being divided, and I was living alone for the first time in my adult life. The silence in our house, my house now, was deafening. "Can I help you find something specific?" A gentle voice interrupted my thoughts. I turned to see an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes kind behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm looking for, well, I guess a beginner's cookbook, something for someone who can barely boil water without burning it." The admission felt strange on my tongue, but also oddly liberating. She smiled knowingly. Starting from scratch. I'm Dorothy. I used to teach cooking classes before I retired." She gestured toward the shelves. "Most people make the mistake of starting too complicated. May I suggest something?" His face fell as he understood what I was really saying. "The woman you were married to needed your validation." She would have dropped everything to try to win you back. But I'm not her anymore. I stood up, gathering my purse. I hope you find happiness, David. I really do, but it's not going to be with me. As I walked away, I felt lighter than I had in years. The ghost of our marriage, the shadow of his disapproval that had haunted my early days in culinary school, finally laid to rest. 6 months later, I was standing in a completely different kind of kitchen, my own. After 2.5 years at Sage, I had taken the biggest risk of my career and opened Emma's Table, a small restaurant focusing on seasonal, locally sourced cuisine. The space seated only 36 people, allowing me to maintain the quality and attention to detail that had become my signature. The opening had been terrifying. Every penny of my savings, plus a small business loan, had gone into the venture. But from the first night of service, we were booked solid. Food critics praised the innovative yet approachable menu, the expertly executed dishes, the warm, welcoming atmosphere. 3 months after opening, Chicago Magazine named Emma's Table one of the city's best new restaurants. 2 months after that, I received the call that would change everything. Emma Martinez? The voice on the phone was crisp, professional, speaking. This is Jennifer Walsh from the James Beard Foundation. I'm calling to inform you that you've been nominated for Rising Chef of the Year. I had to sit down. The James Beard Awards were the Oscars of the culinary world. To be nominated was an honor that most chefs never achieved in their entire careers. The awards ceremony was held in New York, at the Lincoln Center. I wore a simple black dress and stood among culinary legends I had admired for years. When they called my name as the winner, I walked to the stage in a daze. This award represents more than just culinary achievement, I said into the microphone, looking out at the audience of industry professionals. It represents the power of transformation, of refusing to accept limitations others place on you, of finding your passion and pursuing it with everything you have. In the audience, I spotted Chef Rodriguez, who had flown in from Chicago to support me. Mrs. Chen was there too, beaming with pride in the front row. These were the people who had believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Back in Chicago, the James Beard win brought new opportunities. Food Network wanted to feature me in a documentary about rising chefs. Publishers were interested in a cookbook. Investors approached me about expanding Emma's Table into a small restaurant group, but the moment that meant the most came on a quiet Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the awards ceremony. I was expediting orders during the dinner rush when one of my servers approached me. "Chef Emma, there's a gentleman at table 8 who'd like to speak with you when you have a moment." I glanced over to see David sitting alone, studying the menu, with the same intensity he had once brought to legal briefs. He looked up, caught my eye, and raised his glass in a small salute, not beckoning me over, just acknowledging what I had accomplished. I finished expediting the last orders of the evening, then walked over to his table. "The duck is incredible," he said simply. "Everything is incredible. Thank you. I'm not here to ask for anything," he said quickly. "I just wanted to experience what you've built, to understand maybe what I was too blind to see before." I nodded, understanding. We talked for a few minutes about the restaurant, about the menu, about the journey that had brought me here. It was the first conversation we'd had as adults, as equals, since our divorce. "I'm proud of you, Emma," he said as I prepared to return to the kitchen. "Not that my pride matters anymore, but I wanted you to know." As I walked back to my kitchen, my kingdom, my sanctuary, my life's work, I thought about the burned lasagna that had started this journey. That disaster had felt like the end of the world at the time. Now I understood it had been the beginning of everything. The woman who had cried over that failed dinner had been searching for approval, trying to fit into someone else's definition of who she should be. The woman I had become had learned that the only approval that mattered was her own. that success meant following your passion with dedication and courage, that failure was just another ingredient in the recipe for growth. David had wanted a wife who could cook. He had ended up with something far more valuable and far beyond his reach, a chef who had discovered that her worth was not determined by anyone else's appetite, but by her own hunger for excellence. In my kitchen that night, surrounded by the controlled chaos of service, the sizzle of pans, and the satisfaction of perfectly executed dishes, I smiled. I had found my fire, and it burned brighter than any flame on my stoves. The evening continued with its familiar rhythm, orders called out, plates crafted with precision, the ballet of professional service that had become second nature. As the last dessert was plated and sent out, I looked around at my team, young cooks who reminded me of myself just a few years ago, servers who took pride in presenting our food, the dishwashers whose hard work made everything else possible. "Great service, everyone," I called out as we began the closing routine. "Tomorrow we start prep for the spring menu launch." The new menu would feature dishes inspired by my journey, a play on that first perfect scrambled egg, now elevated. With truffle oil and chive blossoms, Mrs. Chen's beef stew reimagined as an elegant short rib preparation, even a deconstructed lasagna that transformed my greatest failure into a triumph of technique and creativity. As I locked up Emma's table, that night, I paused to look through the window at the dining room I had created. The warm lighting, the carefully chosen artwork from local artists, the open kitchen design that let diners see the passion and skill that went into every dish. It was all a reflection of who I had become. My phone buzzed with a text from Chef Rodriguez. "Saw the news about your cookbook deal. So proud of you, Chef." The cookbook would tell this story, not just recipes, but the journey from that burned lasagna to James Beard winner. It would be called Finding My Fire, a Chef's Journey from Failure to Success, and I hoped it would inspire others who had been told they weren't good enough, weren't talented enough, weren't worthy enough. As I drove home through the quiet Chicago streets, I thought about the path that had brought me here. Every burned dinner, every failed recipe, every moment of doubt had been necessary. They had been the heat that forged me into who I was meant to be. David had seen my inability to cook as a fundamental flaw, a reason to end our marriage. He had never understood that I wasn't failing at cooking. I was learning to find myself. The kitchen had become my classroom, my sanctuary, my place of transformation. Now, 3 years after our divorce, he sat in my restaurant eating food that critics called transcendent, realizing perhaps for the first time what he had walked away from. Not the woman who couldn't cook, but the woman who had used that perceived failure as fuel to become extraordinary. The next morning brought new challenges. A food critic from the New York Times had made a reservation for the following week. A cooking demonstration at the James Beard House was scheduled for next month, and 3 potential investors wanted to discuss expansion plans. But first, I had a more important appointment. I drove to Mrs. Chen's house carrying a container of the dish that had started it all, her beef stew, perfected and refined, but still recognizably hers. "My dear," she said, accepting the container with a smile, "you've come so far from that first night when I brought you dinner." I had a good teacher. "No," she shook her head. "You had the fire inside you all along. I just helped you learn to tend it properly." As I prepared to leave, she handed me a small wrapped package. Inside was a worn wooden spoon, smooth from decades of use. "This was my grandmother's," she said. "She used it to teach me to cook in Taiwan. Now it's yours." The spoon felt warm in my hand, weighted with history and love. It would have a place of honor in my kitchen, a reminder that cooking was more than technique or accolades. It was about nourishing others, about carrying forward traditions, about the connection between one hand and another across generations. That Evening, as I stood in Emma's table preparing for another night of service, I held Mrs. Chen's grandmother's spoon and thought about the woman I had been and the woman I had become. The journey from that burned lasagna to this moment had been longer and more difficult than I could have imagined, but it had been worth every struggle, every doubt, every moment of pain. David had wanted a divorce because I couldn't cook. Now, I was an award-winning chef, and he was begging for another chance. The irony was perfect, but it no longer mattered. His approval, which had once meant everything, was irrelevant now. I had learned to cook, yes. But more importantly, I had learned to believe in myself, to pursue my passions relentlessly, to transform failure into fuel for success. I had learned that the most important person to impress was myself, and that the most meaningful victories were the ones that came from refusing to give up on your dreams. As the first orders of the evening began to come in, I picked up my knife and smiled. This was my kitchen, my life, my story, and I was just getting started.